the mindset. You know that if you get locked into a negative gear, it becomes second nature very, very quickly, does it not? I know it's hard to believe that any one of us could ever experience that, but I know firsthand what that feels like. 13 years ago, I left my favorite job at the Mississauga Hospital. 2 weeks later, had one of my favorite children. 2 weeks after that, nearing the end of June, we look around the house, commenting on how tight it's getting. I come up with a brainwave. Joe, you're off all summer. Why don't we renovate? It was one of those that sounded like a good idea at the time. And I and the two children would spend our days and nights at my parents' house. And typically what would happen is I would arrive mid-morning and I would see the Tim Horton coffee cups strewn all around and I'd go, Joe, is that all you did? You knocked one wall down? He said, Carol, you think you could do any better? I said, Joe, if I was PMS, I could knock the wall down, put it back up, wallpaper, and hang the pictures. Well, what was developing was a pattern, and it was called the nyik-nyik pattern. That every time Joe and I looked at one another, if we weren't barking, we were yammering at one another. Halfway through the summer, Joe said, you know what, Carol, I think that we should take that vacation that we have tentatively planned with that couple that hardly know us. They only really knew us as Good Time Carol and Joe, and oh, they were really looking forward to us cycling across PEI together, as I was barely healed postnatally. Well, in order to plan this trip, Joe thought it was a good idea that we go out for dinner and talk about it, just the two of us. Now, I distinctly remember the courtship days of Joe and I. And I remember going to the Steak and Burger restaurant in Hamilton. This one night in particular, the first thing we used to do is move aside the sugar and the salt and pepper from the middle so that we could both zoom in nose to nose and just start chatting away. Because when you're in love, you both can talk nonstop and you take in every word that is being said because you're in that state of love land. And I remember this one particular time just pulling back to take a sip of my water, looking to the right, and there's an older couple sitting there. And she's looking at me as though to say, wait till you're married. And I remember saying, Joe, look at them. That'll never be our problem. Well, not 12 years later, or no, not 8 years later, there we sit at Wong's restaurant. I don't know whether it's still there at Highway 5 and 10, Chinese food. And Joe's watching the Jays game, and I resort to people watching. You know how you look around the restaurant, you try to get into their space, you try to figure out what couple is married, what couple is having an affair, what father's having the kids just for the night because he's treated them too well. You know, this sort of thing. You get into their handbag, you got it all figured out. Well, the fortune cookies come along, and I have my own little technique for fortune cookies. What I do is, when they arrive, I divert Joe's attention, I open them up. If I don't like what it says, I tuck it back in. Joe's not too quick, he thinks they come that way. I pull this one out and it says, think twice before you speak once. I'm thinking, that's not for me, and I tuck it back in. Moments later, Joe opens up, he said, honey, this one's got your name on it. So I stuff it in my shirt. 2 days later, we leave on this trip. The couple in the back is sitting there like this. Oh, it's going to be so much fun. These two are great. I'm going to just like, oh my God, right? And Joe and I, the back view would be this. Non-stop bickering from Oakville to Vermont. That night, I get stuck sharing a room with Joe. We get into the room and Joe said, Carol, I think we got a problem brewing here. If we don't start making some changes with the way we're treating one another, we're going to spoil our trip, not to mention theirs. I said, oh yeah, Joe? What are we going to do about it? He said, I got a plan. He said, you remember that fortune you got the other night that had your name on it? Yeah. What did it say again? It said, think twice before you speak once. He said, perfect. We don't have to start tonight, but tomorrow morning, when we get into that van, before we go to say anything out loud, we have to rethink it until we're able to say it in a positive way. I'm thinking, oh great, I'm going to bed with Dr. Norman Vincent Peale tonight. The next day, we get into that van, we drive in silence for 3 hours. Because you know yourself, if you can't be honest, and if you can't say it, speak it the way you're thinking it, there's no point in wasting your breath, right? Well, after a while, I started getting a little bit bored. So I started making feeble attempts. It started with this. Joe? Yes, Carol? Could be a lot worse, Joe. It's always a good way to start. How's that? We can have my mother and the 2 kids with us, Joe. You're right. Next. Joe? Yes, Carol? I don't mind if it keeps raining for the next 5 days and it has been for the past 3. Why is that, Carol? I kind of like the look that the cyclists get with that brown stripe on their back. Well, after a few more feeble attempts, an interesting thing started to happen in that van. It started with a little bit of a smirk, and then it kind of led to a chuckle. And before you know it, it forced the 2 of us to kind of step outside of our roles and look at what was going on. Then suddenly we realized, what is the big deal? Why are we so deeply entrenched in this role of negativity? Why not let's start sharing some horror stories about the fact that these 2 little babies under 2 and renovating the house? Before you know it, the 4 of us, we're throwing in the stories, we're laughing, and it's like rolling down the window and letting those negative vibes fly away. What you have to learn is that humor does not solve your problems, but humor absolutely helps you cope.